Hello, and welcome to the Certified Welcoming Bootcamp, which will go over the Welcoming Standard and Certified Welcoming Program in depth. My name is Melissa Bertolo, and I am the Certified Welcoming Senior Director with Welcoming America. And I'm joined by my colleague, Irene Paxia, who's the Certified Welcoming Senior Program Manager. In today's recording, we are going to do a quick review of our STAR designations. We'll go over some key definitions and important considerations when thinking about certified welcoming and the welcoming standard, and then we'll do our deep dive. So before we begin moving through the framework areas, I want to remind everyone that criteria are separated into 5 STAR designations. These criteria are cumulative, which means you must meet all of 1 and 2-star criteria to be certified at 2-star. And so similar, if you're going to be certified at 5-star, you would need to meet all of the criteria for 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5-star. Localities are able to select their STAR designations based on either the pre-assessment that you have available or by reviewing the welcoming standard and determining what makes sense for your community. We're always happy to offer a consultation to help you determine what STAR designation you'd like to be assessed for. But I want to remind everyone that we don't tell people that they can or cannot seek a specific STAR designation. We recognize that the certification process is helpful to identify priorities for the work and where to go next. Thus, it might make sense for you to choose 1 or maybe even 2 stars higher than where you know you are because you want to be able to chart your course forward. I also want to mention just a couple of comparisons between the Welcoming Standard 1.0 and certification system that accompanied it. The previous certification system did not have STAR designations, and we chose to transition to this format to increase transparency and accountability for the work. With the previous standard, there was not a visible way to demonstrate to community stakeholders whether the immigrant inclusion work was advancing. We believe that with a STAR designation, localities will be motivated to continue to improve and show outwardly their commitment to this work. I also want to say it's impossible to compare the 2 standards, but we're often asked what STAR would be certified under the previous standard be. And the best equivalency is that it was about a 2.5 star. But again, there's not a true way to compare. And I also want to talk a little bit about the journey through each star before we review the criteria. So a 1 star, and many of the criteria here are really meant to be the foundation of a welcoming community. So ensuring that the criteria in 1 star is in place creates the baseline of infrastructure and also some guardrails around welcoming in communities. 2-star builds on the foundation that has been built. And what we see here often is more community engagement and also some really intentional thinking about equity and immigrant inclusion. 3-star becomes increasingly difficult because there's this expectation to be institutionalizing work across the entire local government and for it to not be isolated in a single department. Additionally, language access and civic engagement are typically big lifts within the 3-star criteria. As we move into the 4-star, this goes back to thinking about the entire community. Again, there are criteria where the entire local government must be compliant, or all departments that are really outwardly facing, and we'll talk about those a little bit later in the presentation. But then there's also criteria that are around community planning and setting goals for immigrant inclusion that are community-wide. And then finally, at the 5-star, this is the expectation where it's not only the community and local government being involved at that locality, but actually then beginning to think about other jurisdictions, including the state, to engage in this work. We recognize that welcoming and immigrant inclusion is not isolated to 1 local jurisdiction. And so the 5-star really takes this commitment to other community members, community advocates, and the state at large. And we want to recognize that in many places, very unfortunately, the states can be very difficult to work with. Our goal with the standard is that no matter what state you live in, you can still be successful and compliant with all 5 stars. Unfortunately, I want to recognize that that does mean some places will take more work based on the state that they are in. I also want to recognize that the welcoming journey isn't always linear. And so some folks might be meeting some of the criteria at 3, 4, and 5-star, but only be fully compliant at the 1 or 2-star level. Next, just a quick overview on the welcoming standard. So the welcoming standard is intended to be a roadmap to creating a welcoming and inclusive community by laying out the policies, practices, and programs that are expected to be in place. We initially developed it in 2016, and our updated version was published just last year in 2023. Both the initial and updated version were created by consulting with Welcoming Network members, national think tank, research and academic institutions, and the public at large. Additionally, we beta tested the welcoming standard in 3 geographically, demographically, and politically diverse localities. And then, of course, in addition to being a roadmap, the standard is the backbone to the Certified Welcoming program. And 7 different framework areas demonstrate that being welcoming is not the responsibility of a sole entity, individual, or institution, but requires a collective impact effort. Before we dive into the criteria of each of the framework areas of the welcoming standard, I want to cover a few definitions and important considerations for how we assess information. When you read criteria in the standard, we try to be specific in naming when it must be fulfilled by the local government. So you will see some words that say, or criteria that say programs, for example. When this is the criteria where it says programs provide support, for example, this could be evidence from a nonprofit organization, a community partner, community-based organization. They could fulfill this criteria. But when it states local government, this means that the local government must be doing the work. So again, this work is expected to be community involved, and that there are criteria that the local government will not necessarily be required to hold responsibility for completing. Also, around the word immigrant, we use this as a very large umbrella term. And so it includes all statuses, immigrants, refugees, international students. It's a very, very broad and general term. It does not refer to specific status or designation. It also actually includes children of immigrants. So US-born children of immigrants, right, who are not actually immigrants, but are children of immigrants. And we do include them in this definition as well, because we recognize the very distinct role that many children of immigrants play in their families. And then immigrant inclusion strategy is also listed here. There are several criteria that name an immigrant inclusion strategy. And so I just want to note that an immigrant inclusion strategy can be formal, as in a strategic plan, or informal, demonstrating that the work is occurring. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we move through the criteria in the next portion of our presentation. A few other things that I want to address first is jurisdiction. So with jurisdiction, and I think this is particularly important for smaller communities, programs and services that are provided by an organization that is actually located in another community can be considered acceptable for evidence. So just for an example, if you're a suburb in a larger metropolitan region, and there's an organization that provides, say, legal services in the major city, and there's not a legal service provider located in your municipality that is seeking certification, it's fine to use the organization that is located elsewhere, as long as you can demonstrate how residents in your community are aware of services and how barriers to accessing those services, such as transportation, are addressed. Next, I want to talk a little bit about jurisdictional authority. So meaning while the local government is the one that's required to be the lead applicant and holds the certificate, there are criteria that must be fulfilled that may not be under the jurisdiction of the local government. This could include initially like the public library. It could include the public housing authority. Those are some specific criteria that are written. And then in a much larger framework, aspect, education and safe communities often come up. So as far as education, there are criteria in the standard that are written specifically for K-12 school districts. And even though those may not be under the jurisdiction of the local government seeking certification, they must still be compliant. Additionally, if you have multiple school districts within the local government jurisdictional boundaries, we request evidence for the district serving the highest number of immigrant students. Within safe communities, the question is typically from counties about their sheriff's office that is separately elected, but the local government may have some control over. And so ultimately within safe communities, for those criteria related to local law enforcement agency, our expectation is that if there is no form of oversight or involvement from the local government seeking certification, then you do not have to provide evidence for those, which is a little bit different from that education area. However, within the local law enforcement agency and safe communities framework area, if the local government seeking certified welcoming has to approve a budget, has personnel policies, or hiring involvement, then the criteria related to local law enforcement agencies are expected to be compliant and must have evidence for. Next, I just want to note that within the government and community leadership framework area, there are several criteria that are marked with an asterisk for 3, 4, and 5 stars. I will discuss these at greater length later on in the presentation, but what this means is that you must provide evidence for the departments that are listed on page 26 of the Certified Welcoming Guide that are under the jurisdiction of your local government. So if for example, if your local government does not oversee child protective services, you're not required to provide evidence for them. However, if that department is under your local government's jurisdiction, then you must provide evidence. And then finally, I want to touch quickly on some frequently asked questions about evidence. But also there is another tool available for community seeking certification, which is called a quick guide on evidence. And you can, if you don't have access to that already, please reach out to us and we'd be happy to provide it to you. So first, one of the frequently asked questions for us is around populations and status. There's a general expectation that evidence should demonstrate that programs are reaching more than one population group. So for example, it's not sufficient to say that a program is available with interpretation for those that don't speak English. You would need to demonstrate that there's clear outreach to ensure people know the program is available with interpretation. Also, there's an expectation for programs to serve multiple statuses. For example, immigration legal services should not only be available for Office of Refugee Resettlement eligible populations and not for anyone else. You should be able to provide evidence that these programs are available to multiple statuses. It does not mean that the same organization or same program has to be available to all, but that there are multiple opportunities to serve populations based on status or based on language as well. And then we often get questions around types and amount of evidence. And so as far as that goes, a general rule of thumb is that you should provide 2 pieces of evidence for each criteria. And that includes especially for when a website is included as evidence, because websites are not always kept up to date or maybe changed. And so wanting to ensure that demonstrating that evidence maintains its integrity over time. And then as far as types, typically if it's a policy, we'll want to see a policy, or agenda items are also helpful. Meeting minutes, social media, presentations, demonstrating types of outreach. So photographs also can be used as evidence as well. As far as expiration, We typically expect evidence to be less than 4 years old, but there may be times when longer than 4 years old is acceptable, such as for a policy that may have been in place and is continuing. And then we often receive questions about whether something is in process or not could be considered as evidence. Typically, we do not accept items that are in process as evidence unless it's very clear that the program is going to be fully up and running simply by a certain date. And so, for example, if we are auditing during the summer and you have a program that's expected to launch with the start of the school year, we wouldn't say that you're not compliant because the school year hasn't started, as long as all of those elements related to staff, structure, programming, resources, funding, if it's a requirement for the program to run, all of those things can be shown into place and you're just waiting on that start of school year to begin. That's an example of when we would accept something that is in process. All right, so that's a little bit of our overview before we get started on the entire welcoming standard. So now I'm going to turn it over to Irene to cover the civic engagement framework area.
Okay, thank you, Melissa. So as Melissa has explained, the welcoming standard is organized in 7 framework areas. We're going to take turns covering those areas, and we will cover briefly the criteria. So let's start with civic engagement. This framework area describes welcoming communities in which all residents, including immigrants, are able to fully participate in civic life. Specifically, immigrant residents have access to democratic spaces and shape community priorities and policies. Immigrants hold leadership roles in the community, and local institutions are invested in increasing access to leadership positions for immigrant residents. So let's take a closer look now at the criteria. And we're going to take a look at the 1-star designation for civic engagement. So the criteria here, there is one, CE 1.0. Civic Engagement 1.0 is programs support immigrants in obtaining U.S. citizenship. The intent of this criteria is to ensure immigrants have support with citizenship exams, applications, and/or fees. And I want to stress here again the word programs. As in all criteria, programs may be run by the local government or by a community-based organization. So in this criteria, programs must support immigrants in obtaining their citizenship, and some examples may be citizenship classes, legal clinics to screen for eligibility and complete paperwork, assistance completing fee waivers, other citizenship prep materials. 2-star civic engagement. The criteria is programs support eligible immigrants in voting. And the intent of this criteria is to support eligible immigrants in the voting process. The expectation is that it goes beyond voter registration. So evidence for meeting this criteria should go beyond supporting voter registration. Let me give some examples that could include, but are not limited to, the following. Voter education or registration workshops, information sessions that specifically target immigrant communities and could cover topics like voter registration, election process, understanding the ballot, polling locations, candidate informations, and key dates. Multilingual voter materials, so providing voting materials, including registration forms, sample ballots, and other informational brochures in multiple languages that are commonly spoken within the immigrant community. Language access at polling places, ensuring that polling places provide language access, including interpreters and translated materials for voters with limited English proficiency. Transportation assistance to polling places, candidate forums, for instance, holding a candidate forum or town hall targeting immigrants as the audience. Civic engagement in the 3-star designation has multiple criteria. 3.0, 3.1, and 3.2. So these criteria are These criteria are about leadership and civic development. The first one, Civic Engagement 3.0, a program supports immigrants in developing civic leadership skills. This criteria has two components: developing civic leadership skills and being accessible to immigrants who may have limited English proficiency. Evidence must demonstrate that the program targets immigrants for participation, or that the program is specifically designed for immigrants. Some examples are leadership development workshops, focus on immigrant leadership development. Topics could include public speaking, advocacy, community organizing, understanding local government, community engagement projects. There could be workshops, advocacy and community organizing workshops, or Seed Academy type programs. 3.1 criteria is a program connects immigrants with local government departments and community resources with the goal of supporting immigrants in navigating and accessing these services. The key word here is connects. The intent of this criteria, 3.1, is the program not only informs immigrants about government departments and community resources, but to have the opportunity for participants to meet key contacts within the departments and organizations in order to better navigate and access community services. Supporting really means empowering here. The goal is to ensure that immigrants can navigate, again, the programs. Some examples are presentations demonstrating the opportunity to build relationship with representatives from specific organizations or specific departments. 3.2, the program that we just talked about in 3.1 is accessible to speakers of languages other than English. The intent of this criteria is to ensure that programs are accessible for people with limited English proficiency. While this may mean that the program is offered in another language or has interpretation available, it could also be fulfilled through the design of the program itself. For instance, sheltered content instruction may be used to ensure accessibility for a program that has multiple speakers of languages other than English. So it could be part, for instance, of a curriculum in an ELL program. Now I will cover briefly the 4-star designation for civic engagement. 4-star designation has 3 criteria, 4.0, 4.1, and 0.2 in the civic engagement framework area. First, 4.0, programs build immigrant youth leadership. This sounds very familiar. It's very similar to civic engagement 3.0, but it is focused on immigrant youth. Programs, again, the word programs, could be developed through community organizations, local government, or even local schools. And evidence must demonstrate that the program targets immigrant youth for participation, or that is specifically designed for immigrant youth. 4.1, programs address barriers to immigrants participating in public hearings and meetings. The intent of this criteria is to ensure public hearings and meetings are accessible to residents, including immigrants. When addressing barriers, programs are expected to identify how they have determined what those barriers are. And please note that language access is specifically named in the following criteria, 4.2. So the barriers being addressed in civic engagement 4.1 should not be related to language access. For examples, they could be about location of meetings, transportation, childcare, the time of day, or general awareness barriers. 4.2 is now about language access. So civic engagement 4.2 programs address language access needs for participation in public hearings and meetings. This criteria, again, is very similar, but language access is listed separately to ensure that it is not the only barrier addressed for participating in public hearings and meetings. Addressing language access includes demonstrating that residents are aware, they know the language access is available for all local program public hearings, local government, public hearings and meetings. For instance, through signage, announcements, information sharing with community partners, and then evidence that the language access is actually provided during a public meeting or hearing should also be provided. Following, I'm covering now the five-star designation criteria in the civic engagement framework area. We have 4 criteria here. Civic engagement 5.0 programs address barriers to immigrant participation on local government commissions and boards. The intent of this criteria is to ensure barriers to serving on local government commissions and boards are addressed. And evidence should address all boards and commissions that are under the jurisdiction of the local government seeking certification. And let me also refer here to the fact that it is a very similar criteria to 4.1. However, the key word here is on versus in. So evidence to demonstrate how programs address barriers for immigrants to serve on local government commissions and boards. This could include efforts to review and update eligibility criteria or broad outreach and recruitment efforts, perhaps a streamlined application process, cultural competency training, or a mentorship program. Civic engagement 5.1. Programs address language access needs for participation in public boards and commission. The expectation is that local government can demonstrate that English language proficiency is not a requirement to serve on local government boards and commissions. This could be demonstrated through simultaneous interpreting for boards and commission, or boards and commissions meetings being held in languages other than English with English interpretations. 5.2, civic engagement. 5.2, programs engage state and or local election offices on barriers to voting for eligible immigrants. The intent of this criteria is to address systemic and institutional barriers to voting. And the criteria states and or to recognize that the efforts to address barriers to voting may occur at the local or the state election offices, but they don't both have to occur. It will look possibly different in different communities. And we recognize, again, that this will look different in different states. We're looking for evidence that demonstrates engagement efforts for purposes such as perhaps advocacy or policy change, working, for instance, with election offices to advocate for policies and legal changes that remove barriers to voting, such as restrictions on voter ID, early voting periods, and access to voting locations. It could be a collaboration effort to improve poll worker diversity, or language access services, for instance, collaborating with state or local election offices to ensure or improve the access to voting materials, such as ballots, voter registration forms, and instructions into languages spoken by the immigrant community. Also providing interpretation services at polling locations. Civic engagement 5.3. Programs provide training to immigrant residents on accessing and using local government's data and information. The expectation is that immigrant residents not only know how to access publicly available information, including by submitting a public records request to the local government, but also that they understand the information provided. This type of educational information could be part of a training addressing criteria 3.0. And we recognize that this type of data and information sharing from local government might not always occur. It is important to understand how to use public records laws Some examples are data literacy workshops, training sessions specifically designed to improve data literacy among immigrant residents, data-driven decision-making workshops, or other data-driven projects. I'm now going to pass this back to Melissa, who will cover the Connected Communities Framework area.
Thank you, Irene. I'm excited to begin covering the Connected Communities Framework area because I think it's one that Welcoming America is most commonly recognized for, since it's focused on building connections, trust, and authentic relationships between residents. I also want to acknowledge that this is probably one of the more difficult framework areas. I think a lot of people typically think of some of the easier lifts, such as festivals and dinners and dialogues, which are really about some of that foundational work of building that environment to begin connecting communities. But I think as we move from 1 to 5 stars within this framework, you'll see a transition from early engagement to sustained and resourced practice. So the goal within within connected communities is to build connections and trust between residents. So community institutions, including local government, businesses, faith communities, and nonprofits, create opportunities and spaces for immigrant and non-immigrant residents to have constructive interactions, develop relationships, and deepen their understanding of one another. Institutions support residents in building their personal capacity to engage with people different from themselves on equal footing and in sustained ways that reduce prejudice and strengthen diverse community relationships. And those are concepts that are really core to social contact theory and are research-based. This aspect of equal footing, sustained, meaning over time. And so we're hoping to see those really being developed and strengthened within this framework area. So first, within 1 star, first there's a couple of guardrail criteria. And so I'm going to talk about those together. And I also want to note that these are written in the negative. So this is to demonstrate that evidence of compliance would be the absence of something. So it'd be the absence of statements, actions, or policies. So the 2 guardrail criteria are CC 1.0 and CC 1.2. So first for 1.0, it's that the local government does not make public statements discouraging immigration or immigrant inclusion. So as this is written in the negative, the expectation is that a media scan from our team would not find articles with anti-immigrant or anti-welcoming comments made by elected leaders or those in leadership within the local government. The burden of evidence is actually really on the Welcoming America team as we do our research and media scan, and it's simply a commitment, a solid statement of, yes, this is something that's not happening within our community. If there is an instance where perhaps you have one locally elected official who is, not on the welcoming bandwagon yet, we have some opportunities to still engage and really think about how to respond to that, and would suggest, if that's something that as you're seeking certification or you want to seek certification, suggest that you speak with a staff member at Welcoming America to talk about whether or not this would be prohibit you from being able to become certified yet. The next guardrail for 1.2 is that local government leadership does not make public statements directly attacking individuals or groups on the basis of their immigration status, national origin, religion, ethnicity, race, gender, and gender identity, ancestry, sexual orientation, or ability. So really here, recognizing multiple types of identity, protected classes, and understanding as well, of course, that immigrants also have, an intersectional identity as well. And so wanting to protect all people is really essential in a welcoming community. And so within this one, it's a similar criteria. It's written into the negative. So evidence would be to demonstrate that compliance excuse me. So evidence to demonstrate compliance would be the absence of such statements. And again, the burden is on the Welcoming America team for ensuring that that type of information is not being stated, but we would expect honesty from the folks getting certified. So the other two criteria within 1 star are 1.1 and 1.3 within the Connected Communities Framework area. And these are really around active participation. So for 1.1, there's ongoing public communication from local government leadership about its commitment to welcoming immigrants. So this criteria is really the invoice of that 1.0, right? So one, we have no communication, no statements being made that immigrants are not welcome. And now this one is having ongoing and regular public statements that immigrants are welcome in a community. And so here, evidence would be those types of statements being made. It could be news articles, press releases, resolutions, minutes or recordings from city council or commission meetings. Those types of evidence would be provided for this. And then 1.3 is that the local government participates in celebrations of immigrant cultures, customs, and beliefs. So the intent of this criteria is for the local government to participate in celebrations that are actually hosted by the immigrant community. And so often the local government might provide evidence of, well, yeah, we host this event, which I think is a really, really wonderful way of showing up. But this is also really saying, what we support those programs and activities that our community are sharing with us, and we're attending those as well. And really the purpose of this is to actively work towards building a relationship with community members. Often evidence will be that that's a staff member, which is a requirement in government and community leadership, might be the one who attends celebrations and events to fulfill this criteria, which is certainly fine. But other departments in local government leadership could also be attending and demonstrating their participation would also serve as evidence. So for 2-star, here we're moving beyond this showing up because I'm invited to begin thinking about how do we intentionally bring immigrants and non-immigrants together. So this is where we'll see probably more dinners and dialogues, films, festivals, food, and types of events maybe that are more beginning to engage people. So for 2.0, we have programs bring together immigrant and non-immigrant residents to build relationships. So the intent of this criteria is for there to be basic bridge building activities taking place in the community with the goal of bringing diverse residents, including immigrant and non-immigrants, together. These programs might be a one-time event, but the goal and expectation is for relationship building and understanding to occur. And then moving into 2.1, we have arts and creative placemaking programs highlight the diverse artistic traditions of the community and public spaces. The goal of this criteria is for immigrant residents to see themselves represented in public spaces. And public spaces means that the location must be easily accessible and does not require showing an ID or going through security to access. So this could be things like a public art installation or a mural, but it could also be other activities that are temporary, such as a pop-up market or a pop-up dance studio type event that we have seen in some other places. And then finally, for 2.2, is that community efforts advancing immigrant inclusion are connected to broader equity work. So the intent of this criteria is to ensure that immigrant inclusion is not siloed from the equity work happening in the broader community. Immigrant inclusion work should recognize the intersectional identities of immigrants and be connected to larger systemic change. And so this criteria has really grown actually out of some of our previous certification work where we were seeing immigrant inclusion being siloed from racial equity work and racial and that advancement. And so we really want to recognize the fact that, many immigrants in the United States are people of color and have very racialized experience in the United States. And so we want to ensure that the work that's happening is part of a larger equity ecosystem. Often, a lot of the evidence for this will be around community organizing, but it's certainly not required to be. So for the 3-star, there's just one criteria here, and it's again focused on equity. So whereas in the 2-star designation, the requirement was for immigrant inclusion to be part of the broader equity work occurring in the community, now the 3-star is for the criteria for local government efforts to be connected. For local government efforts that are advancing immigrant inclusion are connected and are reinforcing the local government's broader equity work. So again, thinking about how to ensure that immigrant inclusion is not siloed from other work occurring. And some examples of evidence that could be provided here might be demonstrating the use of an equity lens that includes immigrant inclusion as well as other factors such as race or language. We have maybe some equity-focused policy integration, equity impact assessments, advisory committees, and so on. And then within 4-star, here we have 3 criteria, and they're all really focused on social cohesion and bridge building work and recognizing biases. So for Connected Communities 4.0, we have programs that serve diverse immigrant and non-immigrant residents, embed strategies to build relationships between immigrant and non-immigrant participants. So this is fairly similar to the criteria in 2-star, which is around bringing people together, bringing immigrants and non-immigrants together to build relationships. But the keywords here are really around embed strategies. And so here what we're looking for is program design. And as such, this might not look like some typical evidence. We're not actually interested in as much as like the program, demonstrating that the program exists, but we're really curious to see how the program has been designed. So here's where we're really looking for understanding, using research based methods, drawing on that social contact theory. And so this would be demonstrating that you're intentionally bringing people together on equal footing, bringing the same people together over time, and identifying and working on issues of common interest. And ultimately, you can't choose a program that's naturally diverse without demonstrating methods and strategies of intentionally building relationships among participants. And I just want to note that while mentorship programs may meet this criteria, the intent is really to focus on equal footing. And so there really shouldn't be a service or a hierarchy component in the relationship building that's occurring. We have some really great resources through Welcoming America when thinking through program design and development, including some toolkits that are published on our resource page that I encourage you to look for, and feel free to reach out if you'd like some recommendations. And then Connected Communities 4.1 and 4.2 are very, very similar. But are written separately because we recognize that the strategies for embedding them might be a little bit different. So the first one for 4.1 is that programs work to address biases about others held by non-immigrant residents. And then 4.2 is programs work to address biases about others held by immigrant residents, right? So these are very, very similar, but just recognizing that the way that we might address biases held by immigrant residents versus held by non-immigrant residents, that those methods and practices might be different, but certainly it could be the same program as well. And so we're just go ahead and move into 5-star. And so 5 stars within Connected Communities is really about institutionalizing the Connected Communities work. So what this means for Connected Communities 5.0 is that the local government accommodates diverse cultural and religious practices in its daily operations. We expect evidence for this criteria to not be for one single department, but should apply across the entire organization. So just some examples of potential evidence that could be used. It could be dress code accommodations that respect religious attire, such as allowing religious head coverings within the law enforcement department, but also, obviously other agencies as well, departments. It could be prayer and reflection spaces. It could be religious accommodations in meetings, accommodations for fastings, and so on. And then 5.1, the last one within Connected Communities, is that programs resource initiatives that bring immigrant and non-immigrant residents together to identify and work on common interests or challenges. So again, we're really building within the welcoming standard here. So 5.1 is very similar to that 4.0 criteria around using those strategies to build relationships between immigrant and non-immigrant participants. But now we really want to see that those programs are being resourced. And what that means is that we're looking for long-term investment in bridge building through staff or funding, and that these programs be research-based. So I'm going to turn it over to Adrienne to cover economic development.
Okay, thank you, Melissa. So we're now going to cover the economic development framework area. In welcoming communities, all residents, including immigrants, can participate fully in the economy. And the economic development framework is designed to include both workforce and economic development infrastructure, where the priorities and needs of immigrant residents and immigrant job seekers are addressed. Specifically, it will include programs that support entrepreneurs, business development, but also workforce development. We'll be looking for those to be accessible to all residents, including immigrants. And also local businesses, their commitment to diverse hiring and retaining of employees with diverse racial and ethnic backgrounds. So let's take a look now at the one-star designation. Here we have two criteria. And again, the criteria in economic development framework pertain to not only business support, but also workforce development. So let's just take a look at 1.0. Programs support immigrant job seekers in finding and obtaining employment. The intent of this criteria is to ensure that career and employment programs are including immigrants in their client populations. This is often filled through a community-based organization. It could be a refugee resettlement program or workforce-based initiative that specializes in serving immigrants. 1.1, programs support immigrant business owners in starting, sustaining, or growing their businesses. Similar to 1.0, the intent of this criteria is to ensure that business development programs are including immigrants in their client populations. Programs may be offered by a variety of places again. It could be a local library, a chamber, or economic development office. It could be a small business development center or minority business development center. We'll be looking for evidence of outreach and intent in supporting immigrants. And again, these programs do not have to be accomplished through the local government, but can be. I'm going to cover again the two-star designation criteria in economic development. Here we have two criteria, 2.0 and 2.1. 2.0 is about programs supporting immigrant adults in accessing additional education to obtain the skills and degrees required to meet their employment goals. Similarly, it intersects with adult education criteria, which we'll cover later, but the expectation here is that the program assesses employment goals and works to support immigrants to achieve those goals. The intent of this criteria is to build on economic development 1.0 and programs now are not only considering immigrants in their client populations, but they're actively supporting, providing access to additional education to support them in meeting their employment goals. Economic Development 2.1 programs address barriers for immigrant entrepreneurs and business owners. Here, the intent is to build on Economic Development 1.1. But programs are expected to address barriers that immigrants face. So the first step is to have a process to understand barriers specifically to immigrants locally. So, for examples, evidence could be a liaison staff position, such as a small business development assistant that works directly with immigrant business owners. The 3-star criteria are about having information on current and projected demographic trends and support in communicating foreign work experience. We have 3 criteria. 3.0, local workforce agencies have information on current and projected demographic trends of the local immigrant population and the unique barriers faced by immigrant job seekers. The intent is to engage the local workforce board with understanding the demographics and skills of current and anticipated or arriving immigrant populations. The goal is for workforce agencies to use the information about immigrant populations to develop programs and services to serve their skill set and match local employer needs. 3.1, programs support immigrant job seekers in communicating foreign work experience and skills for U.S. employers. The intent of this criteria is to build further on Economic Development 1.0 by supporting immigrants with foreign work experience. So 1.0 likely supported recent arrivals in the U.S. In finding immediate entry-level jobs. Here, the intent in the 3-star is to ensure that immigrants have support sharing information about their prior work experience in a way that demonstrates their skills and job readiness for the U.S. job market. 3.2, chambers of commerce and/or economic development agencies are engaged in immigrant inclusion work. The intent is to demonstrate that the private sector is engaged in immigrant inclusion work. Depending on your locality, it could be a chamber of commerce or economic development agency. And evidence would demonstrate that they are included in immigrant inclusion work. Economic development 4-star. Here we have 2 criteria. 4.0, programs support immigrants in meeting occupational certification and/or credentialing requirements. The intent of this criteria is to ensure that certificate and credential programs are accessible to immigrants. Note here that there is a difference between certifications and licenses. So certifications are issued by non-governmental certification bodies, whereas typically licenses are awarded by federal, state, or local government agencies. So licenses convey a legal authority to work in an occupation, while a certification on itself does not. This criteria is often met by community colleges. 4.1, programs support immigrant business owners in accessing capital to start, sustain, and grow their businesses. Now we're thinking about access to capital, ensuring that capital is available and accessible to immigrants. The intent is to build on 1.1 by supporting business owners with access to capital. For instance, we've seen flexible lending criteria, microloans and grants, or crowdfunding, other loan packaging with flexible criteria for non-traditional credit history, for instance. Five-star criteria in economic development framework area are about state and private sector. We have 5.0, 1, 2, 3, and 4. Let's start with 5.0. Programs work with relevant state agencies to address barriers to occupational licensing for immigrant residents. This criteria is very similar to 4.0, but intent to specifically address state regulations that make it difficult for immigrants to be licensed. It's less about engagement, which is not required to be compliant with this criteria. It's more about demonstrating understanding of specific licensing barriers for immigrant residents. For instance, we've seen career guides or a review of licensing policies in this direction. 5.1, programs work with employers to build welcoming work environments. So as far as employers, the expectation is that we're not looking at the employer's good practices. We're not auditing individual employers. We're looking more at the presence of programs that bring employers together to work on these things. 5.2, programs work with employers to identify and address barriers to hiring immigrant job seekers. The intent of this criteria is to demonstrate that programs work across multiple employers to build welcoming work environments. It is similar to 5.1, but specifically it includes identifying and addressing barriers employers face in hiring immigrant job seekers. 5.3, programs work with employers and immigrant employees to identify and address barriers to retaining immigrant staff. The intent of this criteria is to ensure that immigrant employees are engaged in the work to create welcoming work environments, specifically as it relates to retaining immigrant staff. It is similar to 5.1. The intent is for the programs to work across multiple employers, identify trends of why employers may have difficulty retaining immigrant staff. And a note here that there is no expectation that immigrant employees be directing their feedback directly to their employer, but rather that the intent is here for multiple employers to engage in a program. 5.4, programs address barriers to obtaining local government procurement and contracting opportunities. The intent of this criteria is to identify and address barriers that immigrant business owners face when seeking to obtain local government business, local government procurement and contracting opportunities. We're now going to cover the framework area of education with the help of Melissa. Thank you.
Thank you, Irene. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, we often receive questions around jurisdictional authority related to the education framework. So related to schools aren't under the local government, or which schools do you want us to include? So we're typically most interested in public K-12 schools. But if there's a large private charter school that's serving a large immigrant population, please feel free to include their information. Additionally, if your community has multiple school districts, you'll be expected to know which of those have the largest immigrant populations and provide information on those. I also want to note that this framework area does include adult education in each of the star designations, and only for 4 and 5 stars does it address early childhood education. And so within the education framework area, the goal is that all students from early childhood through adulthood have the support they need to succeed in school and the education they need to succeed in the workforce. So within the 1-star designation of education, we're looking to ensure that that programs address barriers to navigating K-12 schools as well as adult English classes. And as mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, when demonstrating that programs are addressing barriers, there's an expectation to also demonstrate how barriers are identified. So within ED 1.0, programs address barriers to navigating local K-12 school districts for immigrant families. So here, the intent is to identify and address barriers that immigrants face when navigating their local school district, particularly with enrollment. Some common types of evidence might include family liaisons, newcomer welcome centers, assistance with enrollment when someone is a new arrival, and so on. Within 1.1, the criteria is that local K-12 school districts provide language accessible information about the school system and services available to immigrant families. So here, the intent of this criteria is that immigrant families receive information and are able to communicate with school staff in their home language, whether that be through translated materials and interpretation services or bilingual staff. I want to acknowledge that while language access is a federal requirement for public schools, we've also seen many places, unfortunately, still not providing it. So we do want to name language access explicitly here. And I also want to note that machine translation, such as Google Translate, is not accepted as evidence unless there is an additional layer of human oversight of that machine translation. But typically, oh, we provide, Google Translate on our website. That's not sufficient evidence here. ED 1.2 is that programs work to address barriers to adult English language classes. So here, barriers should be identified as part of the evidence and be specific to your community. A common form of evidence is demonstrating how English language providers are working together in order to identify and address those barriers that have been coming to them, identified by their students or by their program, and then are able to work in a collaborative setting to address those. For the 2-star here, we have 3 criteria. So the first is 2.0, programs support immigrant family engagement in their child's education. So this is a program and is not required to be family engagement programs through the school district. So here we're thinking about family engagement strategies, meeting parents and families where they are, which might be outside of a school setting, but really thinking about providing that support for a child's education. We have 2.1, which is programs support immigrant students in understanding and accessing higher education opportunities. The intent of this criteria is to demonstrate support for immigrant students who are graduating high school with accessing and navigating higher education opportunities. The evidence here should be intentional about understanding barriers that immigrant students face and demonstrate more than the regular school counselor or all school FAFSA night. So really thinking intentionally about what are those barriers within your state or your community, whether that be having in-state tuition for students without authorization and so on. So how ensuring that those types of navigating higher ed opportunities are available. And then we have 2.2, which is that programs address barriers to the adult education infrastructure for immigrant adults. So this criteria is very similar to Education 1.2, but now we're looking at all of adult education infrastructure and not just adult English classes. So this is going to vary, of course, depending on the community. And some places might have a really robust adult ed infrastructure, and some places won't really have many programs at all. So really, again, expecting for those barriers to be identified. Again, good practice to include immigrants in that identification of those barriers and to provide evidence of that. But so some of the infrastructure that we would expect to see here within the adult education space might be workforce development programs, adult basic education, and transitioning to higher ed. So within 3-star, we have 4 criteria here. The first is related to professional development. Education 3.0 is programs train K-12 educators and staff on teaching and supporting diverse student populations, including immigrant students. So the intent here is to ensure that non-English language learner teachers or English language arts teachers, and staff are receiving training on teaching and supporting immigrant students. The training does not have to be mandatory, but it is something that should be encouraged and provided multiple times over the course of one's career. I also want to note here that training opportunities might be different, of course, depending on your school district, but also that it doesn't only have to be one particular group every single time, and that the staff could refer to any of the district's employees. So that could be the front office staff, but also cafeteria workers, school bus drivers, and others who might have frequent contact with immigrant students and families. For 3.1, we have programs support immigrant students in accessing career technical education. So this is really referring to career tech programs at the high school level, and ensuring that they are accessible to immigrant students and that they have the support that they need. Again, one of the things here, of course, with Career Tech, of course, is that it's a federal program implemented within high schools. But we might be looking at recruitment or admissions processes to ensure that there aren't any undue barriers. For 3.2, we have K-12 schools support immigrant students that have limited or interrupted formal education to attain their educational goals. So this is, the acronym would be SLIFE, or Students with Interrupted Formal Education, SIFE. And so here we're really thinking beyond learning English. So many of these students might require assistance with learning to read and write, taking the bus, following a school schedule. And so also recognizing that due to the circumstances that caused limited or uninterrupted formal education, many students may experience additional stress, trauma, or frustration and are at risk of dropping out of school. And so providing some additional support for these students is the expectation here. And also as a baseline, really, for families to know that they have a legal right to enroll their student in school up to that maximum age set by each state, even if they've recently arrived in the country. So within Ohio, where I live, the maximum age is 21. And so here, if a student were to come at the age of 18, for them to still know that they have the right to enroll in the traditional high school. And then 3.3, we have programs provide contextual English language classes for adult English learners. So contextualized English classes is really often seen within workforce development programs, but it's not required for compliance with this criteria. So the intent here is to really think about, learning English within a specific content-focused area, not just, pure academic English. And so, again, many times this is within a workforce development setting, such as becoming within a food or healthcare setting, but we could see it, also with just more daily activities, such as grocery shopping or riding the bus. And then for 4-star, we have programs work with K-12 schools to regularly collect feedback from immigrant families on the school environment. I want to note that there are some federal requirements around collecting feedback, but the goal here is really around ensuring that that's intentionally reaching immigrant families and that the data is able to be disaggregated and considered based on an immigrant background. Certainly, we recognize that you're not going to ask your students immigration status when collecting this information, but there are other ways to perhaps have a proxy, such as an English language learner, home language, and so on. And so really thinking about how that data might be disaggregated. And then here, also the intent isn't to not only collect that feedback, but to use that feedback, right, to improve the school environment. 4.1, programs address barriers to participation in family engagement programs for immigrant families. So this is similar to that 2-star criteria around supporting immigrant family engagement. And now we're addressing barriers to family engagement programs. And so here the expectation is for this to include the school district, so those K-12 school districts for their family engagement programs. And so the question is really around identifying what those barriers are for the engagement and then what needs to be changed to address those. And then here for 4.2 is the first time that we see early childhood education and care showing up. So programs address barriers to early childhood education and care for immigrant children. And so I just want to recognize, right, that many families use more informal care arrangements. And so the goal here is to think about how we can ensure that those caregivers are supported in ensuring that there's additional developmentally appropriate education and is integrated into their care as well. So early childhood education is really referring to those more formal, perhaps daycare or preschool settings. And then care is really referring to those informal childcare arrangements that many families use. And then finally, for the 5-star, here we have 4 different criteria. I'm starting off with Education 5.0, K-12 schools accommodate diverse cultural and religious practices in daily operations. This is really similar to that connected communities criteria where we're looking at the government operations as well for accommodating diverse cultural and religious practices. I want to note here that the intent of this is for it to apply to the students, so we wouldn't be looking at personnel policies, but are again thinking about recognition of holidays. So for example, this would be New York City recognizes Eid in their district and has an additional holiday for that. It could also be cafeteria food, which kind of goes back again to thinking about that training of staff, right, of having cafeteria workers also trained around that. So that's the 5.0. And then we have 5.1, programs support immigrant students in accessing mental health services. So we're going to cover equitable access next, but I want to recognize that mental health is addressed in that criteria. But we really wanted to ensure that immigrant students and their mental health are also addressed here. So immigrant students here refers to those up to high school. We're not thinking about the adults, and that's really in the next, in the equitable access framework. But really wanted to address mental health because it's such an important issue. Schools have such an important opportunity to be able to recognize and identify mental health concerns within youth. And then also, unfortunately, the mental health crisis that we have among youth and young students today. And so we really wanted to put it here to explicitly mention as well. And then 5.2 is immigrants engage the state government on expanding access to adult education programs for immigrant adults. And so here, engaging, just want to note that the intent is to demonstrate efforts to engage the state, but you don't have to be successful with that engagement. So what this means is that you could demonstrate some efforts at having meetings to expand access to adult education programs, but then those state departments that are responsible might have still said no. But you have to demonstrate that intent of making some change. Also, programs here, just want to note again, programs means that it does not have to be the local government. So recognizing sometimes some challenges between local government and state government. And so this work could certainly be done by others, more perhaps advocate based organizations as well. And then last, we have 5.3, very similar to 5.2. So programs engage the state government on expanding access to early childhood education and care programs for immigrant children. So again, similar to 5.2, as far as engage the state government, again, the expectation is to demonstrate consistent efforts of engaging the state, but does not require those efforts to be successful on expanding that access to early childhood education and care programs. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Irene to um, cover equitable access.
Okay, thank you, Melissa. Equitable access. So equitable access includes a group of criteria that are about local services being accessible to all residents, including immigrants. Immigrant residents provide feedback to local government and community organizations to identify disparities and gaps and improve access to a variety of areas, including housing, health, transportation, financial services, and the justice system. Equitable access in the one-star designation, we find one criteria, 1.0. 1.0, local government departments disseminate information on government services, resources, and public benefits with the goal of expanding access to immigrants. The intent of this criteria is to demonstrate that information is disseminated, again, with the goal of expanding access to immigrants. For that reason, information machine translated, such as Google Translate, is not in itself sufficient to demonstrate the goal of expanding access. For instance, some examples of what we've seen might be the relationship and the utilization of trusted partnerships within the community to then further disperse information about local government departments. Again, the expectation here is to have some type of intentional strategy about how the information is disseminated. Next, we're going to look at the two-star criteria for equitable access. We have 4. 2.0, information from the local government that we just covered in 1.0 is communicated through outreach methods that are proven to be effective in reaching immigrant residents. So in this criteria, we build on equitable access 1.0. The expectation is that there is clear evidence to demonstrate that the immigrants are receiving information. So the first star, we cover the goal of reaching immigrants. Now we have actually been able to do research and demonstrated that, yes, those methods that we are utilizing are indeed effective in reaching immigrants. 2.1, programs address barriers to immigrants accessing and navigating preventative healthcare. This criteria is often met through healthcare centers that have sliding scales or healthcare providers that speak languages, multiple languages besides English. And other communities have used accompaniment programs or navigation programs, community healthcare programs that again provide access to preventative healthcare. Equitable Access 2.2, programs inform immigrants of workers' rights. The intent of this criteria is to ensure immigrants are aware of their labor rights, regardless of their immigration status. Common examples of evidence include workshops and information sessions, multilingual materials with evidence to see how materials are actually distributed, know your rights campaigns, and so forth. 2.3, equitable access. Programs address barriers to digital inclusion for immigrant residents. This criteria is possibly met in a variety of ways, depending on specific barriers and characteristics of your community. For instance, we have seen evidence of Wi-Fi expansion access, or maybe access to devices, or even computer literacy programs. Now we're going to cover the 3 stars. Here we have 3 criteria. 3.0, information from the local government as disseminated in 1.0 is provided in languages other than English. So the intent of this criteria is to ensure the information the local government disseminates on government services, resources, and public benefits, again, is available in multiple languages. So we're going probably beyond what would be vital documents translation, requiring the local government to actually go beyond what would be basic federal language access requirements and or machine translated translation, which would not be enough for this criteria. EA 3.1 programs address barriers to immigrants in accessing immigration legal services. The intent of this criteria is to demonstrate that barriers have been identified and that programs are being developed to address the barriers to access immigration legal services. And we would expect the barriers would differ from community to community, as immigration legal services varies greatly across the United States. So some examples may be legal clinics and workshops, legal hotlines, accredited representatives, other type of traveling legal services or legal representation, when again, programs are accessible to all immigrants, regardless of their immigration status. Equitable Access 3.2 programs address barriers to immigrants accessing and navigating maternal and infant healthcare. Now, healthcare comes back. The intent of this criteria is to identify and address barriers that immigrants face in accessing and navigating maternal and infant healthcare. There are several federally funded programs, including Medicaid, CHIP, WIC, and other early childhood home visiting programs that exist, in particular those states that have expanded coverage to immigrants that would not otherwise be eligible under federal restrictions, typically would meet this criteria. Again, evidence must demonstrate that the programs are reaching and serving immigrants. We're now covering the 4-star. In the 4-star, we have several criteria again. The first one is 4.0. Programs address barriers to immigrants accessing and navigating mental health services. So we've seen mental health being recognized as a need within the education framework area. Now it's brought back again, and it's about the entire community. The intent is to demonstrate that barriers to accessing and navigating mental health care are identified and addressed. So, for examples, we would accept community-based providers that share the same cultural, linguistic, and ethnic backgrounds as those experienced by the clients they support, community outreach and workshops, or kind of collaboration with community leaders where mental health providers collaborate with community leaders or religious figures to reduce the stigma associated with mental health issues. 4.1 covers housing. Programs address barriers to accessing rental housing for immigrants. The criteria requires the locality, once again, to first identify barriers and then to develop programs that address those barriers. In this case, it's about rental housing and the barriers related to rental housing the community is facing. 4.2, it's about mobility efforts. Local mobility planning efforts address the needs and priorities of immigrant residents. The intent here is for local initiatives that are focused on enhancing or improving transportation and mobility systems, and for those efforts to include immigrants in planning and to demonstrate, again, how efforts address immigrants' needs and priorities. Efforts refer to initiatives undertaken by the local communities, again, and they could be very diverse depending on the community. There could be community engagement and feedback, for instance, engaging the community through public forums, surveys, and feedback mechanisms to understand how transportation needs affect all residents, including immigrants. It could be last mile connectivity programs addressing the last mile challenge by providing convenient and efficient options for residents to reach their final destinations. Now, 4.3 is about access to civil legal services. This criteria is very similar to Equitable Access 3.1. The intent of this criteria is to identify and address barriers that immigrants face in accessing civil legal services. So while immigration legal services were the focus of 3.1, the intent here is for civil legal services such as domestic relations law, housing law, and employment to be addressed. Just a note here that the presence of a legal services corporation in itself may not be sufficient evidence due to possible federal restrictions on which immigrant populations may be served. So perhaps a combination of a legal services corporation with other methods such as clinics or workshops could be considered. And that's it for 4-star. Now in the 4-star for equitable access, we have again 4 criteria. The first one is 5.0, information from the local government. Here we're referring again from the disseminated information from the local government in 1.0, is proactively written and designed with translation and the diversity of residents in mind. So the intent of this criteria is to demonstrate a proactive approach to translation that integrates translation considerations. So not just word for word, but considering design, formatting, literacy level into the initial creation stages of documents. Good practices in design and translation involve an inclusive and proactive approach that, again, integrates translation with other consideration. It could be inclusive imaging use as well, accessibility and usability, a collaboration really between designers and translators. Also, consistency across languages is a key consideration. 5.1, programs address barriers to homeownership. So the intent of this criteria is to identify barriers to homeownership that immigrants face, as well as designing programs that address those barriers. 5.2, programs work with the state government and or regional transit authorities on expanding access to transportation, including addressing the needs and priorities of immigrant residents. Here, the intent is for programs to work with the agency governing public transportation. So depending for your community, could be a state or a regional authority. And again, include the needs and priorities of immigrant residents when working to expand access to transportation. And then 5.3, programs provide training to those in the legal system on the potential impact of criminal convictions on residents with different immigration statuses. So the intent here is to provide information and training to those involved in the legal system, such as private attorneys, public defenders, district attorneys, so that they understand how criminal convictions would impact non-citizens' ability to remain in the United States. So that concludes the equitable access framework area. And now we're going to cover government and community leadership. And I'm going to pass it back over to Melissa for this.
Great, thank you, Irene. So with government and community leadership, as I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, there are a number of criteria that have an asterisk next to them in the standard, and these begin within the 3-star of that framework area. So 3, 4, and 5-star designations, there are multiple criteria that have an asterisk. And this asterisk means that if any of the departments listed here on this slide are under the jurisdiction of your local government, then you must provide evidence for them for you to be considered compliant during the certification process. We will not interview all of these departments during the audit, but evidence must be submitted for all of them. These are also, again, on the page 26 of your guide to Certified Welcoming and the Welcoming Standard. And again, if you ever have any questions about any of these, please don't hesitate to reach out. So I'm going to start off with the 1 star. And for 1 star in government and community leadership, there are 3 items that must be fulfilled. So the first is that the local government has to have 1 or more staff positions whose responsibilities include advancing immigrant inclusion. I want to note that the Certified Welcoming Program does not explicitly list full-time equivalency as a requirement for staff positions dedicated to this work. This flexibility recognizes that the allocation of a full-time staff may vary based on the size of the local government and the resources available for implementation. We do see this as one of the core foundational pieces for certified welcoming. Without having the local staff person championing the work, it can easily fall to the wayside. A few key things to consider within the staff position is demonstrating work that is both internal to the local government, as far as moving the needle within those local government processes, like language access or training of government staff, but then also external, that there's a liaison between local government and community members. So immigrant inclusion work should be part of a formal job description, but it could also be part of a larger diversity and inclusion portfolio. 1.1 is that the local government has a process in place to ensure regular communication with immigrant residents. The intent of this criteria is to ensure that there are known processes for communicating with immigrant residents, particularly those with limited English proficiency. This criteria is intended to be flexible for smaller and lesser resourced communities who may need to rely on community partners for sharing information with this population. And then finally, the last criteria for 1 star is that public libraries implement an immigrant inclusion strategy. So again, as mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, an immigrant inclusion strategy may be formal or informal. However, it's expected to be based on clear understanding of demographics of community members and ideally with their input. Public libraries play such a pivotal role in providing a space where everyone feels like they belong. We want to recognize their importance and also ensure that they're actively engaging immigrants in their customer base. So for 2 star, we have a number of criteria that are focused on a group. So I'm going to focus on those together first, which are 2.1, 0.2, 0.3, and 0.4. Then I'll go back to 2.0 and 2.4 because those are focused on the immigrant inclusion strategy. So I'm going to start off with 2.0. I'm not going to go straight through. So the first for 2.1 is that a group of local leaders and residents regularly convenes to advance immigrant inclusion efforts. So the intent of this criteria is to utilize a collective impact approach for immigrant inclusion. I want to note that the group that convenes does not have to solely focus on immigrant inclusion, but it should be a part of its overall strategy. Typically, quarterly consultation meetings required for refugee resettlement providers do not meet this criteria because their focus is so limited to the ORR population and to the refugee resettlement process. Additionally, the group that's focused on immigrant inclusion should not be solely focused on the local government, but should have a community-wide effort. So that's for 2.1 around the group. And then the other criteria are really about the makeup of it. So 2.2 is that participants of the group advancing immigrant inclusion reflect the diversity of the community and demographics, constituencies, and sectors. So the intent here is to make sure that this group is not siloed, and that it's not solely focused on one particular area. So it wouldn't just be focused on economic development, or it wouldn't just be focused on education, for example, but that it would have a holistic approach, that it would be cross-sector. And then also diverse in its makeup, that it would include immigrants and non-immigrant members, representing the racial and ethnic demographics of the community. And then 2.3 is that the group advancing immigrant inclusion has a process in place to ensure regular bidirectional communication with immigrant communities. So here we're really thinking about, how is this group set up? How are their meetings run, perhaps, or what are their strategies for community engagement? And so the intent with this then is to really ensure that the group is informed by and responding to immigrant needs and priorities. Bidirectional communication ensures that the group both disseminates information to and receives information from immigrant residents. And although immigrants are required to participate in the group, as per our criteria of GL 2.2, that participation is not enough to meet the criteria of 2.3. We recognize that sometimes people are gatekeepers, and so a group is not going to be your entire community either. And so really thinking about how do we ensure more information and communication to be shared both ways. So multiple pieces of evidence are likely required to demonstrate this bidirectional communication, and it will also be confirmed as part of our audit process. And then 2.4 is that the group informs local government staff and is able to provide direct feedback on issues impacting and priorities of the immigrant community. Really the intent here is that the local government is involved in the group. So most often this is that, the government staff person is attending the meetings, but also that there's opportunity for feedback to go to other government departments as well. All right, so now I'm going to go back to GL 2.0 and 2.5 because those are now actually focused on immigrant inclusion strategy. And again, these could be formal or informal. So 2.0 is that the local government leadership has an immigrant inclusion strategy for its departments and agencies. So the intent of this criteria is to ensure that immigrant inclusion work is not siloed to a single department or staff person. And this strategy could be formally written, outlining specific goals, action plans, and responsibilities or departments. But it could also be demonstrated informally. So for example, a city manager or mayor, when they have their regular department head or cabinet meetings, this might be something that's an agenda topic in those leadership meetings and serve as a platform to discuss progress and challenges and strategies for enhancing immigrant inclusion. And so that could be a way to demonstrate it informally. And then 2.5, local recreational programs implement an immigrant inclusion strategy. So again, this could be formal, such as part of a strategic plan, or information and demonstrating that the programs and outreach of the recreational programs are intentional in reaching their immigrant community members. Particularly, I would say one way to demonstrate this is perhaps by, the local recreational programs having received feedback from immigrant residents about the types of recreational services and programs that they would like to be have available, and then those rec centers or recreational programs very clearly receiving that feedback and then designing programs based on their recreational needs and priorities. And I also want to note here that recreational programs are intended, it says programs here, so it could be community-based or through the local government. So it could be your YMCA perhaps, or it could be, your Recs and Park department. Okay, we're going to move on up to 3-star. And we've talked about language access, in different framework areas and already at different stars. But just want to note here that within the 3-star of government and community leadership is where we really begin to be very explicit about institutionalizing it within the local government. So for 3.0, the criteria is that local government departments know the demographics of the immigrant population and have access to tools to serve those residents. So here, This is a criteria that has an asterisk. So all of those departments that are listed, again, that are under the jurisdiction of the local government are expected to provide evidence as far as this. So some examples, right, of knowing your demographics and having access to tools. Again, these things might be different, most likely depending on the department, because those tools to serve residents, that could be perhaps bilingual staff. It could be having, interpretation services, translation, but really thinking about like how are these departments interfacing with community members and with immigrant populations. And then knowing the demographics, right? Knowing which languages are being served within a community, knowing which countries, perhaps some different cultural components that are important, particularly within that local government department specifically. So, EMS might have some very different knowledge than, say, human resources, just as an example. 3.1 is that the local government has a language access policy that includes interpretation and translation protocols for all externally facing government departments. So again, this one's an asterisk. So these are all departments that are interfacing with the public need to have a policy with translation and interpretation protocols. This is possible that it's one policy for the entire local government, or it's possible that every single department has their own separate policy. This will really depend on what your local government has in place. And then just a note about what is a policy here. It's something that could be an executive order, an internal administration policy, such as something signed by your HR department, or it's also something that perhaps is an ordinance and has to go formally before your city council. We move into 3.2, the local government provides regular training to its staff about language access requirements, available resources to provide meaningful language access, and working with speakers of languages other than English. Just want to note here, right, that perhaps 3.0 and 3.1 are the same criteria, or excuse me, the same evidence. That's fine. You can certainly use the same evidence for multiple criteria, but we also have separated them because sometimes people will be doing one thing and not the other. And so the training here, the expectation is that it's regular, and we do not define regular, but it is something that should be provided multiple times throughout someone's course of career with the local government. So it's not something that is only provided, for example, as a new hire during the orientation process. This is also assessed during the audit by ensuring that people understand and know about language access, and as employees of the local government, that they have those services available to them. And then 3.3. We have the local government regularly assesses language access needs and usage across departments in order to improve each department's ability to conduct business in languages other than English. So here, right, the intent is for the local government departments to really know, who which departments are regularly using language access, perhaps which departments might need some more training or assistance with accessing the services that are available. And then also really thinking about the usage to be able to identify perhaps some demographic trends that are occurring or changing within your community. Again, within 3-star, all of the criteria have the asterisk next to them. So all of those departments are expected to provide evidence. All right, then move on up to 4-star. And 4-star really builds on that group that was established in the 2-star. So the first criteria is for 4.0, is that a community-wide strategy for immigrant inclusion is set through a feedback process, including immigrant and non-immigrant residents representing the diversity in the community. This community-wide strategy is often created by the group in number two, in that two-star criteria, but it's not required to be. Um, and whereas in other criteria, the term immigrant inclusion strategy could be formal or informal. In this criteria, it's expected to be formal. It's expected to be published and a public document. And so for 4.0, we're looking for two different things here. The first is that there is a community-wide strategy for immigrant inclusion. And the second is that that strategy is set through a feedback process that has included immigrant and non-immigrant residents. Evidence for both of these items must be provided. Good practice is to ensure that, it's larger than just that group that's setting your community-wide strategy, that there's more people being brought to the table through that feedback process. Perhaps through focus groups, perhaps through surveys, through and other types of community engagement strategies. 4.1, that there's a process in place to regularly update the strategy with feedback from immigrant and non-immigrant residents. So the expectation here is to regularly revisit the strategy. It doesn't have to be formally rewritten, but there's a process for monitoring and updating with direct feedback and engagement from the community. The expectation is for this to happen every 4 years. But if a community-wide strategy has not been in place for more than 4 years, then the expectation is to have a plan for how it would be updated. And then 4.2, we have local government departments annually set and monitor goals for immigrant inclusion, informed by the needs of immigrant residents and the community-wide strategy. So again, this criteria has an asterisk, which means that all of those departments are expected to provide evidence for it. So this criteria is looking for two things again. Or actually 3 things, I think. First is that your local government is setting goals on immigrant inclusion, and also that the goals are informed by immigrant residents, and also that the goals are informed by the community-wide strategy. So really, if that community-wide strategy is being informed by immigrant residents, perhaps it's also going to fulfill that component that the goals set by the local government departments are informed by immigrant residents, but also recognize perhaps that community-wide strategy might not touch on everything related within a local government department. And so some additional community feedback would be essential for setting those goals. All right. Finish up government and community leadership with the 5-star. So here we have a number of criteria. The first 2 are really closely related. So we have 5.0, local government departments have programs that build relationships with immigrant residents. And 5.1, local government departments have programs that address the needs and priorities of immigrant residents. Again, it's possible that the same evidence for these 2 criteria could fulfill both of them, but also recognize that they're slightly different. And so it's definitely possible as well that you might have some different strategies for them. And again, both of these criteria have the asterisk, so you're expected to provide evidence for all of the departments under the local government. So for building relationships and addressing building relationships, the intent here is for local government departments to be better informed of immigrants, to understand, what their needs and priorities are, and that there are very specific programs or activities related to that. 5.2 is that local government departments receive training on working with diverse populations, including immigrants. So here are the criteria. Again, perhaps that same training for language access is going to be able to fulfill this criteria, but again, it might be a different strategy as well. Because often language access training might be very short, and really just making sure that people have the skills and knowledge to access the services for ensuring interpretation is being provided, for example. And so this criteria then could build on that. And it's really around ensuring that maybe some common DEI or implicit bias trainings that might be provided to local government staff include a lens around immigration, immigrant inclusion as well. And again, that criteria has the asterisk, so all of those local government departments are expected to be compliant. And then 5.3 is that programs engage regional jurisdictions on adopting and implementing welcoming policies and programs across the region. So here we have the intent of the criteria is to create welcoming regions, and not just one city or jurisdiction is committed to welcoming. And so regional jurisdictions refers to geographically proximate locations, such as suburbs or a county. And the other localities are not required to have adopted welcoming policies or programs for this criteria to be considered compliant, but they must have been engaged in some type of way. Again, I want to recognize that this criteria says programs engage regional jurisdictions, so it's not the local government's responsibility to engage those other jurisdictions. Certainly, they could be doing that work, but also perhaps there's a nonprofit community partner that is really thinking about creating a welcoming region. And then the last criteria in 5-star is that the local housing authority implements an immigrant inclusion strategy. So recognizing here that very rarely is the local housing authority under the jurisdiction of the local government seeking certification. And so with 5-star, really thinking about expanding welcoming to other agencies that are typically not under the jurisdiction. And so this would include the local housing authority. As with other criteria that include immigrant inclusion strategy, the strategy could be formal or informal. However, demonstrating language access does not constitute a strategy. And the expectation or intent here is for the local housing authority to be regularly considering immigrants in their overall strategy and work plans, and then also really recognizing how different statuses are still eligible for some housing authority programs, and simply because someone is an immigrant does not actually preclude them from participating. And so we have some really great resources around that as well. Again, as always, encourage you all to reach out to us to access them. I am now going to pass it over to Irene for Safe Communities.
Okay, thank you. Thank you, Melissa. So we're now going to cover the Safe Communities framework area, which is our last framework area. This group of criteria are about the ability to prioritize safety for all residents, including immigrants. It's about policies that prevent discrimination, strong trusted relationships being built with law enforcement and emergency response and fire department, partnerships being built to identify gaps in services. So let's take a look now at the 1-star designation criteria in the Safe Communities framework area. 1.0, local law enforcement agencies have programs in place to build trust and mutual understanding with immigrant communities and immigrant serving organizations. The intent of this criteria is for the local law enforcement agency to be working actively to build trust and a two-way relationships with immigrants. Programs that build trust could be community policing programs and other intentional efforts to build trust and relationship with immigrants. Safe Communities 1.1, this is what we would call a guardrail criteria. Local law enforcement agencies do not have policies in place where the primary purpose is to detain or deport immigrants. So in addition to the absence of a formal policy whose purpose is to detain or deport immigrants, surveillance technology contracts will be evaluated for their information sharing practices to ensure that technology is also not used for the purpose of detaining or deporting immigrants. Just a note here that if there are other law enforcement agencies that operate in your city or county, but your local government does not have any authority over them, those will not be held to the criteria. Now, covering the 2-star safe communities criteria, we have 4 criteria. And here we're moving from building trust and relationships to more advocacy and immigrant rights information, knowing that typically nonprofits will lead such efforts. So we have Safe Community 2.0, programs inform immigrants of their rights and responsibilities when interacting with local law enforcement and the legal system. And also 2.1, programs inform immigrants of their rights and responsibilities when interacting with immigration enforcement and the detention system. Again, the word programs, so these can be community-based efforts or local government efforts, where the intent, again, is to provide information, know your rights, and could be the same program or separate program that provide information on the rights and responsibilities when interacting with both local law enforcement and the legal system, as well as immigration enforcement and the detention system. 2.2, local law enforcement agencies have programs to ensure regular communication with immigrant residents. This criteria builds on Safe Communities 1.0. where there is an intent to build trust and mutual understanding between immigrant residents and the local enforcement agency. The key word in this criteria is regular, so demonstrating that programs are intentional in communicating with immigrant residents by establishing ongoing relationships, hosting ongoing proactive opportunities to meet with one another. Some examples of these are the assignment of officers as community liaisons, for instance, that regularly engage with immigrant communities, hosting regular community meetings in or town halls where law enforcement officials can share updates, address concerns, and listen to feedback. Also, advisory boards or councils composed of representatives from immigrant communities, as well as online communication systems where there are digital platforms that allow for regular sharing of information, education, safety tips, as well as updates with immigrant communities. And this would be also an opportunity to see two-way communications with law enforcement and immigrant communities. Again, we're looking for intentionality in the programs to ensure that immigrant communities are included. Ongoing and regular communication is present. 2.3, programs connect immigrant victims and witnesses of crime with community resources. The intent of this criteria is to ensure that immigrants are aware of resources available to them as a victim or witness to a crime, including but not solely immigration-related resources. So core law enforcement advocates may fulfill this criteria. Also, programs supporting victims of domestic violence meet this criteria, but there is opportunity to meet this criteria through other victim and witness programs, including gun violence prevention programs. We're now going to take a look at the 3-star designation criteria in the Safe Communities Framework area. We have 3 criteria. The first being 3.0, law enforcement staff receive regular training over the course of their career on working with diverse residents, including immigrants. So regular training, this means that training is provided not just at the time of recruitment and the academy, but is available throughout the course of the career. Many academies have some type of cultural competency training or anti-bias training, which is great. But again, we need to have evidence that officers have the opportunity to take the trainings multiple times, and also evidence that these trainings include information on how to work specifically with immigrant populations. 3.1, a policy is in place that clarifies the jurisdiction and separation between local law enforcement and federal immigration enforcement agencies. So we recognize that in some states, this is difficult. The goal here is to ensure the local policies are still compliant with state law. And again, this criteria requires the actual presence of a policy that clarifies the jurisdiction and separation between local law enforcement and federal enforcement of immigration. Safe Communities 3.2, local emergency management agencies have a plan to inform immigrants of community emergencies, and that plan includes communication methods that are effective in reaching speakers of languages other than English. The intent of this criteria is for local emergency management agencies to be actively considering how to reach immigrants when developing their emergency management and response plans. Depending on when the plan was developed, evidence of the plan being utilized and being effective in reaching speakers of languages other than English should be provided. So the plan should be written down and methods of communication should be known. Now the 4-star criteria, we have 4.0 and 4.1. 4.0, local emergency notification platforms are available in languages other than English. So here we're specifically naming platforms, which are communication systems utilized to inform residents of local emergencies. Machine translated or Google translated text alone is not considered sufficient evidence for this criteria. Some examples of evidence may include the demonstration of text alerts with pre-translated messages to deploy in emergency situations, clear methodology for translating emergency information with time-sensitive deadlines, as well as evidence of translated press releases, emergency notifications, or other communications that was used in previous emergencies. 4.1, the local government has a process in place to identify the priorities and goals of immigrant residents for creating a safer community. So here, really the intent is to recognize that safe communities should be defined by the residents, and there should be an effort to solicit feedback about the needs and priorities for the safe communities from the residents, which include immigrants. So evidence is expected to demonstrate both the process to collect feedback and how the local government has actually responded to learning about needs and priorities. So demonstrating action. And it could be fulfilled with a community-wide strategy and feedback process that we talked about in the prior framework area in GL 4.0, or it could be a separate safety plan or a neighborhood safety plan, or again, other community planning processes. Now the 5-star designation. So here we have 2 criteria related to safe communities. Safe Communities 5.0, local law enforcement has 1 or more staff positions whose responsibilities include advancing immigrant inclusion. This criteria could be fulfilled by either a civilian or a sworn officer. However, it must be within the law enforcement division. So we will be looking for a position description that includes advancing immigrant inclusion work. 5.1, safe communities, law enforcement agencies publicly share data on arrests, jail population, use of deadly force, resident complaints, and language access usage. And this data is aggregated by race, ethnicity, gender, and geography. So data should be published and available. It wouldn't need to be just requested through a public records request for it to be considered compliant. And also, not only should be available, but it should also, again, should be disaggregated. Some examples of evidence could be data dashboards, annual reports. Some of this data could be covered in one or more tools, and it will depend on the specifics of the community. So we are now done with the 5-star in the Safe Communities framework area. So congratulations for covering an overview of all 7 framework area. And I'm going to pass it back to Melissa.
All right, thanks, Irene. So during this presentation, we were introduced to the Welcoming Standard, and our overview included a review of our STAR designations, some key definitions and important considerations related to the Welcoming Standard. And then we did our deep dive on the 7 framework areas. We hope that this information was helpful to you and that you are excited about how your community can meet either 1 or 5 stars of the Welcoming Standard. I encourage you to keep in touch. Here's some of our information, both Welcoming America and then, of course, our email of certified@welcomingamerica.org. I mentioned lots of tools, and those are all on the Welcoming America website, or you can reach out to us directly and ask for them. So with that, thank you so much for participating, and we hope that you have a great day.